think we'll start by having each of our panelists kind of briefly introduce themselves. You've met a couple of them already today, so pertinent details, star sign, that kind of thing, and then we'll get into. I've got about half a dozen questions, and we've got 40 minutes or so. So depending on how verbose people want to be in their answers, there will be more or less time for questions from the audience. So go ahead, Gavin.
I'm Gavin. Hopefully you guys remember me from earlier today. I'm a Virgo. And yeah, I guess that's all I need to talk about.
We have to say our signs as well?
I was kidding, but I'm a Gemini, so there you have it.
My name is Dan Carwin. I'm the engineering director for the Rabbit team. I'm essentially the people manager for the Rabbit team, and I'm an Aquarius.
Hello, I'm Carl. I'm on the one of the developers on the core team. I'm an Aries, I think.
And I'm Carl, CEO of 84 Codes, and yeah.
Okay, well, we clearly have a lot of diversity in our star signs on the panel, so we'll go with that. So the first question, this comes up a lot with folks initially wrapping their heads around RabbitMQ, is understanding the use cases for it. So I'd like everyone on the panel to chime in with their favorite, which is if the house is burning down and you can only take one use case with you, this is maybe not a good reference to make given what's happening back home in California for me, but if you can only take one use case, what would it be? And then conversely, what's the one that just makes your nose wrinkle with a bad smell? So favorite and good and bad use cases for Rabbit. We'll just start on this end.
Well, I'm a big fan, as I mentioned before, of the event stream. I find that that's the most valuable thing from a business perspective and engineering perspective. Least favorite, sending large, opaque binary things through Rabbit, like big images or videos or that sort of stuff. It really doesn't like that, and yeah.
My favorite use case, I think, is integrating systems written across different generations in different languages, taking advantage of Rabbit's large collection of various language clients and allowing those types of applications to communicate with each other. My least favorite use case of Rabbit is as a data store.
That was my least favorite as well. Least favorite is probably is, maintaining very, very large queues and maintaining them for a long time. It's a bit of an antipattern. If you're never going to empty them, that's going to be a big problem. I think Rabbit is such a diverse and flexible tool. It's very hard to choose a specific use case because it's made for so many of them. So for me, the best use case is when your uncertainty is high, when you don't actually, you need messaging, but you don't actually know exactly what kind of messaging or even what kind of protocols that you actually want to use for your messaging solution. That's, I think, when you're uncertain, I think it's a pretty certain choice that you will be able to do it with RabbitMQ.
Yeah, I can only agree. We like to see it when people do building big microserver architectures and using RabbitMQ as an event bus or event stream. But yeah, it's one of the benefits with RabbitMQ that it can support so many use cases like RPC and stuff like that. So while other message queue solutions are maybe more specific, targeted to one use case. And worst, yeah, long queue. That's the most problematic use case, having very long queues today. I don't think it's inherently bad using it, but today RabbitMQ doesn't scale very well with long queues, unfortunately.
Okay, well that makes a nice segue to our next question, which is around some of the common pitfalls for using RabbitMQ. And then just to counterbalance that, maybe some of the features that often go missed. We've kind of heard a couple things today already mentioned that seem like potentially good but overlooked features. So we're going to work back from the other direction just to shake it up a little here. So Carl with a C, common pitfall and overlooked feature.
What we see as a problem often is the memory usage of Rabbit. And it often comes down to two things, either that you have too long queues or you have too many connections or very high connection churn. So that's true problem areas today for our clients today. And what was the second question? Like
An overlooked feature.
Overlooked feature.
If you were to shine a spotlight on a feature that you think more people should take a look at and incorporate into their practice, as a yoga teacher might say.
Maybe the TTL, like dead lettering and TTL. It's a great feature if you do it. A lot of customers try to use the delayed message exchange, which is not great because it stores all the delayed messages in amnesia and it's only on a single node and it's all problematic. So, and it's zero introspection. So you can't see which messages you have you're delaying or how many messages you have delayed. So we typically recommend using TTL and dead lettering. You get much better introspection, etc. But if you do it on a huge scale, like some clients, then there's some problem areas with that too. But that's if you're dead lettering tens of millions of messages at the same time.
Right, okay. Well, I was really pleased to see a talk on the consistent hashing exchange. I think it's underused. I think that's a really nice plugin, and it's with some nice improvements of in the latest version as well. So, that's good. In terms of, I think for me, casting my mind back when I actually used to use RabbitMQ rather than develop it, over-reliance on RPC type patterns is something I found a little bit unhelpful. Sometimes you have to do RPC. Sometimes RPC is a very important thing. You need a response. You need a response from your web app or whatever. But I saw people building applications using RPC as a default means, whereas a more asynchronous pipeline type of pattern would have performed and done a much better job. So I guess that's probably my contribution.
Thanks, Carl. In terms of the features that are overused or
No, overlooked.
no. What's the first part of the question?
Pitfalls.
Pitfalls.
Common
Yes. Let me start with
pitfalls.
pitfalls because I watch all the support escalations come in. RabbitMQ has a lot of guarantees, message safety features, and one of the largest pitfalls that I see is customers turning them all on and using them all at once. When you read the documentation, you see things like HA-all. It's very attractive. So the pitfall is overuse of guarantees without the realization of the cost, performance-wise and complexity-wise and stability-wise in these. So, for example, just mirror those messages which are truly critical. If you're setting up a 2 data center implementation, just replicate only those messages that you absolutely need to be in that second data center if the first one goes down. I guess in terms of underused features, I'm a fan of the event exchange, which can be used by people to see what has gone on previously. It's valuable in troubleshooting scenarios, and I'd like to see people use more.
Gavin?
We wanted a debate and controversy, right?
Yeah, maybe not throwing chairs like a Jerry Springer show, but you can go ahead and
Stop using celery. Things that are problematic. I think relying on frameworks that abstract away what you're doing and understanding the tool that you're using is bad. And when you have a hammer and everything looks like a nail, it's really easy to write code against something like celery and not understand the ramifications of the things that you're doing. So yeah, there's that. And then I was actually surprised in reviewing for my talk. The RabbitMQ team is prolific and has been for some time. And staying on top of what features are there is hard. And I don't know why. And I wrote a book on Rabbit, and for some reason I missed the fact that there was this automated reply to mechanism that doesn't create a queue for your RPC publisher. It just directly sends the replies to it. Blew my mind. I'm like, how did I miss that? I don't even know what version that came in at. So there's that. But hunting through their extensions is something I would recommend doing.
Well, no one stormed out when you mentioned not using celery, so maybe it wasn't controversial enough.
Stop using Kafka?
No. All right, well, so my next question is kind of around scaling, and there's lots of dimensions to how to scale Rabbit. We had an interesting discussion in our prep call on this. And so if there was one thing that you could change about the way Rabbit scales, what would that be? But then on the flip side, if there was something about how it scales today that you would absolutely keep, what would that be? And we're gonna go in the middle, and I'm gonna go to Dan first.
It's good.
We're gonna go out of order, and the whole ordering thing from Jack's presentation will come into play.
So the one thing that I would change about Rabbit scaling today is the fact that the management plugin, the number crunching for the statistics that you see in the management UI takes place on the same nodes that does the message processing. If I were able to do it again, and we may do it in the future, is to separate the management interface from the actual message processing, so that what happens today is if a node slows down for whatever reason, you can't get management information from it, which really impedes your ability to work on it. And it also can limit scaling in an absolute sense. I'm not sure. I'm not really prepared to answer the other half of the question. What would I absolutely keep? So I'll pass to Carl and let him cover me on that one.
Thanks, Dan. That's very helpful. Yeah.
Sure.
So I'm going to answer the same question that you managed to answer. It's kind of related, because scaling out the management data would be effectively adding a new kind of type of node into your RabbitMQ cluster. And I think something I'd like to see at some point in the future, and this is completely on the top of my head now, is being able to have nodes of more different types. So maybe so that you can scale maybe in different ways depending on your use case. So say, for example, you had nodes that only kind of handle connections at the front. So you could scale them independently of the nodes that serve the queue data, for example. That might give you more flexibility to scale Rabbit in ways that you don't, you're not able to the same degree now, because if you add more Rabbit nodes, you will replicate metadata across all the nodes more, and declaring queues will become slower the more nodes you add, and things like that, writing to the database. What was the other one?
Well, you would
the one we're trying to avoid.
Yeah.
Well, I think at the moment, and this would just be kept by default, but Erlang by default scales up very well. So getting bigger boxes, getting faster boxes with more cores, more processes is a good way. And it's certainly something that would remain as long as it was written in Erlang. So.
Yeah, that's typically how we scale up our clients to give them larger and larger boxes. I think we have some running on over 100 cores and quarter terabyte of RAM, etc. And Erlang scales very well in a single machine. The problem with scaling horizontally for many of our clients is queue location, to spread out the queue master between these nodes, and when a node disappears, not moving that master node, etc., etc. That's a bit problematic today.
I'd agree on the problematic side. I'm actually quite excited for the raft-based queues because I think that could potentially help in that area. But rebalancing queues I see as a big problem from a scaling perspective. In fact, I had a production issue about a month ago, primarily focused around two things. One, the management interface not responding, and it was because too many of our high volume queues were sitting on the same node of this particular 3-node cluster. What would I keep? I think one of the really strong features that Rabbit has from a clustering perspective is that my clients can connect anywhere in the cluster and talk to any resources without concern about locality. And while locality is important in really high throughput performance clusters, that flexibility of being able to enter the cluster from anywhere and do whatever it is I need to do, I think is very powerful.
Okay, so Michael went over a lot of the roadmap earlier this morning, and so we'll start with Carl with a K on this one. But what are some of the things that you're looking forward to the most in terms of the roadmap?
I'm really looking forward to getting the quorum queues out. It's something I've been heavily involved with, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how people use them. They're not, by default, a drop-in replacement of your classic queue or your other queue or HA queues or mirror queues, but they are there for a very specific use case. When you really need data safety and replication. And we've designed them as such. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that pans out.
I'm really looking forward to the churn statistics that you're providing in 3.8. Because that's something we're monitoring today in a kind of crude way through the event exchange. And it's a bit annoying to have a separate application that collects the churn statistics, because that's a big problem for a lot of our customers.
I am looking forward to something a little bit further on, and I think Michael may have discussed this as I slept through his talk this morning. But it has to do with the loosening of our adherence to the 091 AMQP protocol in introducing native processing for additional protocols, which could speed up MQTT traffic, for example.
All of the above. I know it's kind of cheesy, but it's. I think the quorum queues are going to be huge. Getting those statistics are going to be great. And I think moving away from the AMQ model at the core of RabbitMQ from a long-term perspective is really what's going to ensure RabbitMQ's longevity. So I'm excited about that as well.
And that sets up our next question well, which is about kind of following on your talk, Gavin, how RabbitMQ is modeled around the AMQ with its adapters or translators. So looking out into the future, and we've kind of touched on what's on the roadmap there, how does it grow beyond AMQP? Do we need to change the identity completely? How might we get there? What are some of the different paths? Everyone wants to weigh in around that, but we'll start with you, Gavin, since I know you have strong opinions on this.
Sure. So probably my most controversial thought around that is I'm not a fan of AMQP 1.0, and I think that the committee that made the protocol did a disservice by abandoning 0.10. And I think that the protocol or the AMQP specs should be forked, and the broker implementers out there should somewhat come together and figure out how do we extend what's there, because like I said, it is extensible. RabbitMQ is proof in the pudding, and I think that there are small things that can be done to make the protocol better in the long run. Outside of that, I think finding ways to support things like gRPC or HTTP2, HTTP3 from a interface perspective gives it a place in what I'll say is current state-of-the-art hipster programming, and that's always good.
Is that with pour over coffee? You said it.
Exactly.
Hand ground, yeah.
Yeah, hand ground from small batch shade grown beans.
When I work with customers, I talk with customers that use various messaging types. They love Rabbit, but for example, to go back to MQTT, for example, they're not able to effectively use Rabbit for their MQTT processing because of the overhead of the plugin system, where we have to translate those messages. So I'm very much looking forward to a time where we can remove that layer of translation, give native processing speed, but still make available the routing logic, what we love about 091, and allow that to be leveraged by messages which are sent into the broker with other protocols.
Yeah, very similarly on the same point. I think things like exchanges, bindings, queues, vhost, all those things are very much part of the RabbitMQ model, not just part of the AMQP 091 model. And I think it's pretty safe to say that they're going to be around for a very long time. But how we transfer messages from one point to another is I think, there's opportunity there to do better than we are doing at the moment. And there are protocols that do better, have more flexibility, more flow control at different levels of the message transfer. And the first step to get towards that, and as we already mentioned several times, is to make all protocols more equal in terms of how they interact with queues and exchanges inside RabbitMQ, and not pay that extra cost that the additional protocols are at the moment. And once we've done that, who knows what's the best protocol to actually be the primary protocol, if there's going to be such a thing.
Yeah. Looking at other protocols, I think that clients should to support horizontal scaling better. I think the clients have to be more cluster aware of all the nodes, and AMQP doesn't really have support for that today, or AMQP 091. That's one way. I think some areas in QP protocol could use some improvements, like the connection establishment process. There's 8, 9 packages back and forth. Huge delay in setting up a connection, even more if you have TLS. But essentially, I really like the model of exchanges and routing keys and everything. It makes the protocol very extensible. And yeah, it is extensible, adding new features to the protocol without having to redefine the protocol itself. It's great.
Okay, well, so yeah, some of these ideas would potentially introduce a lot of different challenges in terms of maybe adding more complexity in other areas. So, how might you think about mitigating some of that as you try to move forward with being able to support more protocols natively? Throwing in a curveball question that wasn't on the list. It's really for anyone. I won't make everyone answer.
That's kind of interesting, because when you think about it, whether you're talking about JMS or Stomp, MQTT, the identity of how those protocols behave are fundamentally different than the AMQ model. So as you move away from that strong identity, do you lose functionality that we gain from AMQ? With, for example, you have a lot of customers talking about MQTT. You guys maintain and work on Mosquito. It's like, how do you think about the differences of that? It seems like that would be a difficult bridge to cross.
Sorry?
Well, just in the model differences in the way that we think about topics, or the native type of behaviors. It's a hard. It almost seems like you have to say, yes, RabbitMQ supports MQTT natively in the way MQTT works, and we provide a bridge so that you can talk to it with other protocols. Even if those are first world citizens, you still have to kind of have that terminology or data model difference. No?
Yeah, like today, the MQTT adapter doesn't support quality of service level 2, for instance, and some other limitations. That is hard to implement with the current adapter kind of thing. So yeah, it's not fully protocol implemented.
We've had to go out on a limb in some cases in the way that we've implemented authentication and authorization on top of MQTT because the protocol doesn't include these areas and customers demand it. So this is where we hang ourselves out a bit. Yeah, any further?
I think actually removing the kind of the hard dependency on 091 would simplify things, if anything. You can the protocol that you have internally inside Rabbit from the time that your whatever protocol is has been passed in terms of how they interact with the queue would have to be generic enough to support multiple protocol. I think there's always going to be a potential for some loss of fidelity or some part of the protocols that you can't support, but I think we can do a better job without being tied to the 091 model. So I think it's a simplification in itself.
And another thing is that RabbitMQ tries really, really hard to not write messages to disk. It tries to cache it, and suddenly when it runs out of memory, it has to write it to or offload it to disk, and then you hit a wall, basically, or clients do. They're publishing fine in 20,000 messages a second, and then suddenly 200 messages a second. No, but I think it could be possible to just write the messages to disk and not f-sync them, but let the OS do the caching, the whole file system caching layer. Maybe that could simplify things. Maybe RabbitMQ was built in a time where the hard drives were much, much slower than they are today. SSD drives are much better today than the disks were back in 2008 when RabbitMQ was developed. So that focus on keeping messages in RAM maybe is a bit unnecessary today.
Okay, so my last question before I open it up to the audience, and then we're sort of between y'all and lunch, which is a very dangerous place to be, is really kind of around the RabbitMQ community. That's one of the things we've kind of gathered here for. And so, just again, to kind of have a balance, what do you love today about how the RabbitMQ community works? We've heard some examples throughout the morning in terms of the extensibility through plugins and new languages that are supported for those. But then if there's conversely something that you could change about how it's working today, what would that be? So a little bit of each. We'll start with you, Gavin. You look like you're ready to go.
I think the mailing list actually is an example of where the community shines. I think that, whether it's users helping users or the RabbitMQ team putting up with the repetition of the same beginner questions, I think that's really cool. I think that as a community, we could do more to better onboard people from that perspective, in that I know at least from maintaining client libraries or trying to support users, the questions are always the same, the problems are always the same, and there's only so many times where you could say, hey, can you go back and learn how to search on Google before you ask this question again? And I think a lot of that goes to how you onboard people. And while the RabbitMQ documentation and examples have gotten us this far, I definitely think that there are things that we can do from a community perspective that makes it even more approachable.
I think if you can solve the "did you try Googling that" question, you've solved something across many communities and professions. around the world.
Well, I know that there are other communities that, from an onboarding or documentation perspective, don't have as much of it. It's not such a high percentage.
And just to check in here with folks, how many folks here are on the mailing list? So to kind of attest to what Gavin says about, okay, so those of you without your hands raised, you might either be suffering from a rotator cuff injury. I know that those are rampant whenever there's a gathering of people, but obviously something to check out because it seems like good stuff. All right, Dan.
Yeah, this question gives me the opportunity to express thanks to 84 Codes and to Erlang Solutions for putting together this event. This is an example of open source community working, right? We talk about sometimes there are scandals where you have one set of people writing the open source code base and other people, quote unquote, exploiting it, right? Well, we have a community here where we have mutual investments. We have companies supporting each other and covering bases. I'm also constantly impressed by the contributions we get from various members of the community contributing code, bug fixes, and so forth, going through the CLA process. And that's the measure by which I can see that we have a healthy community, as opposed to other companies who do all the coding themselves, get no contribution. We have a very lively discussion. We have a lot of people contributing. I'm grateful that my team is so responsive to questions from both beginners and experts alike. We work very hard to be ethical when it comes to debates online and to maintain the high road, and to not attack other open source code bases or commercial code bases that we may be overlapping or in competition with. So I take a lot of pride there. I think RabbitMQ came from a very developer-oriented mindset when it was incepted. One of the things that makes Rabbit special is all of the ability to configure Rabbit is available through the developer API. So there wasn't this separation of church and state where you had operators and developers. Developers could configure the system as well as attach to it and send messages and receive messages from it. So what that meant, and what we've built up as a legacy of developer-oriented documentation and so forth. What I see today in the area of in the arena of hosted cloud computing is a great increase of operators who don't come from a developer background. And I'd like to see us as a community move toward creating documentation, tutorials, education, services that serve these operators who are responsible for Rabbit but really don't need to or aren't deep into the APIs and the interfaces. They don't know where it may fall over. And from a support perspective, this is the group of people that often steps over into a trouble area, and then we have to rewalk them and say, well, look, you've turned on all your message guarantees, and that's why it's slow, things like that.
No. Well, thank you to anyone here in the audience who's one of those community contributors that Dan mentioned. So this is great work that you're doing. Carl?
Yeah, that was really good, Dan. I don't know how I can follow up on that, but yeah, I think RabbitMQ wouldn't be very much without its community. It's kind of what drives it. It's where we get all the feedback from. The mailing list, obviously, we get a lot of early feedback, which is very important. We also get other feedback channels, but they tend to be slightly slower. I think we could probably do a little bit better in terms of exposing best practices through the APIs that some of the libraries and tools that we provide expose, and kind of help people fall into the right patterns rather than kind of have this very big, flexible open model, which you have to learn very thoroughly and make mistakes and then correct them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One question is the RabbitMQ.com website, is that like on a public repository that they can contribute to? Okay, good. Because one really big thing about RabbitMQ is their website and the tutorials there. I think that's one of the big drivers for adoption. That it's so easy to get started. The other one is the management phase. The management phase have some drawbacks, but it it's better than most other management interfaces for most other kind of database or services, servers. Gives great inspection and everything. Yeah, like I guess for us, we provide our own. We provide guides and everything on our website, but we should certainly try to help the RabbitMQ.com too, because that's a big portal to all new RabbitMQ users. The mailing list is great. We try to provide bugs and things that we find there. And yeah, we're trying to set up these events. There's probably going to be more events in other parts of the world to bring more people together, have to provide these talks, and yeah. So we're trying to do our part in this.
All right, I'll open up to the audience to see if anyone else has any questions for our esteemed panel, whether you want to hear the full gamut of answers or just targeted questions. Felipe. Oh.
Hi. So it's kind of an opinion from you guys. Just to let you know, I'm an instructor. I think I'm the only two left, right, from the pivotal kind of we're only two, right? But and always we've been asked something like, hey, we're getting into this kind of a container-based stuff. And sometimes it's like, hey, don't do too much like a Docker because you're increasing, you're scaling up, scaling down, and we already know that the niche database is very fragile at some point, right? So far, we've been seeing like, or most of our clients, they are still doing virtual machines, right? Virtualization only. So what are your thoughts about Kubernetes and put Rabbit inside Docker containers? And if at some point, right now we've been kind of taught that Docker or containers are ephemeral at some point and they're going to crash. And suddenly try to recover from a Docker instance on Rabbit, it could be kind of painful, right? So I don't know your thoughts about Kubernetes and actually support kind of a RabbitMQ there.
I think you can do it. It's not ephemeral just because it's running in a container. That's just isolation, right? And Kubernetes is going to provide orchestration, and there's safe ways to do those things. There's safe ways to use auto-scaling groups in Amazon. Using containerization or auto-scaling groups to scale on demand up and down, that's not a good idea. But for having golden image deployment of Rabbit, where you know that you don't have to worry about the configuration management aspect of things as much, or you don't have to worry about artifact differences, that's great. Those systems are really good for that.
To go back to the community reference, we're very fortunate that Rabbit is popular enough that there are open source distributions of an official Docker image, a Kubernetes image today. And thankfully, we don't have to own or maintain those. That being said, we are continuing research internally in an R&D sense, looking forward. Can we enhance these? Can we make a Pivotal branded commercial version that includes value-added features? And so we're looking at, we're doing research in these areas, and possibly in the future we will have, Pivotal branded version of RabbitMQ on Kubernetes with extra features that make it more resilient, easier to deploy, templating, etc.
I guess you can put, if you're not a heavy RabbitMQ users or not using your RabbitMQ user heavily, then you can put it in a Docker instance. And with a lot of other Docker instances on the same machine, but if you're running out of resources or resource contention, a lot of apps doing a lot of I/O, then your RabbitMQ will suffer, and it's just harder to diagnose and see like what is it that's using up all these resources. Why? I wouldn't put my big database in a Docker instance, for instance, but I guess you can do it, but I wouldn't do it. Neither would I with RabbitMQ.
Thank you. Any other questions? We have a couple more minutes.
You mentioned like something about how good is the community. One community that's been growing a lot recently is the Elixir one. Do you think in terms of adoption for future of Rabbit, it would make any sense to build some specific modules in Elixir to try to attract new community members?
How would that help? So I guess is the question. I mean, RabbitMQ is an Erlang application that it's 11 years old. It's been Erlang for a very long time. The core of RabbitMQ is Erlang, and Elixir fits very well in it, as we've seen. Today, it's once you get over the initial hurdle, which is a learning curve thing anyway, it's perfectly possible to write plugins in Elixir and to run code inside the Erlang VM written in Elixir, but surrounded by Erlang. I mean, it's all the same, really. Our CLI tools are written in Elixir, so we already have Elixir in the code base. We haven't really seen a massive increase of Elixir developers contributing. I mean, actually contributing to RabbitMQ to the core RabbitMQ is quite hard anyway. The difficulty is not necessarily in the language, it's understanding how RabbitMQ works internally and what's actually, the trade-offs and why it's done the way it is. So from that point of view, I don't know if driving specifically fitting Elixir into the code base would gain us much necessarily.
From one perspective, having the core team write demonstration Elixir plugins might be beneficial. As tutorials, we could consider that. Another thing that I think we can do is keep our eyes open to good Elixir plugins that the external community develops, make sure we promote those on the web page that lists plugins and so forth. It's challenging sometimes when you list something on the website, it's a tacit endorsement of that. And so you only want to list solid ones, whether it's a partner, a plugin, or language client. So we have to do some filtering without being too arbitrary. But that's certainly something that I'll be more aware of looking forward, is what can we do to encourage Elixir plugin developers and to take that into account as we go forward.
Was your question focused primarily server-side and RabbitMQ kind of ecosystem, or were you thinking more like, how do we get more Elixir developers using Rabbit as clients?
The first part.
Okay. Just making sure.
Other questions?
Maybe just adding a bit on top of that, as I wrote some plugins in Elixir. So I strongly advocate trying Elixir for writing plugins, but I would really personally be against trying to adopt Elixir within the core platform, because one of the most important things as a developer when you're approaching a code base is consistency in the code style as well as the languages. So I would really not like to have to understand a code base which is written in two different languages. My head would really start spinning. So even if I'm familiar with both languages, let's stick the core to something and then use modular design for the rest.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Oh, another one over there. This side of the room has more questions, I'm observing.
So looking at RabbitMQ and the AMQP091, and then going towards what's happening on specific environments like Microsoft and using AMQP10, and speaking earlier about the more generalized internal usage of a more general protocol rather than 091. Do you see that is where Rabbit is moving towards, in the sense that everything in 091 is built around exchange, binding, and queue? Or what do you see the real future of RabbitMQ is?
Should I start that one? So are you talking about the future of RabbitMQ in terms of its internal architecture? Okay. Yes, definitely having what Michael in his talk referred to as a protocol agnostic core is definitely somewhere we want to go, because it will bring us a lot of benefit and it will simplify things internally as well, which is, I think, is really important when you really want to kind of, firstly, guarantee performance, stability, and things like that. The simpler things are, the better you can do with that. So yeah, I think we're definitely going towards that. But as I said earlier, I think things like exchanges, I think is part of the RabbitMQ model. The exchanges, there's so much built on top of them. There's so much functionality that is enabled by exchanges, and we vhost, that's an important thing for people who want to partition things like permissions and applications. So I don't think those are going to go anywhere. But as I said, how we transfer messages, what protocols we support, I think that's possibly where the future development would lie. But that's all in the future.
Maybe to elaborate on the question side of it, when you look at, for example, the management interface, and you look to get a message or publish a message in there, what's happening underneath the covers is there's an AMQP client internal connection that's made. Is the idea that somewhat goes away, and instead we start talking about, I don't know, the queue as a first world citizen object that is bypassing the protocol to communicate with it, and instead something more Erlang-y, or what's the thought there?
I think it needs to be discussed. But if it's possible and it's simpler, why not?
All right, perhaps on that note, we'll thank our panelists, thank the audience for all your questions and participation. As we head out to lunch, just now you know their faces and you can pepper them with questions in the hallway. Thank you.